took responsibility for and dealt with. So that's kind of that's it for me. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. Kimmel, for your presentation. I don't see any questions for you, so thank you very much for your presentation this afternoon.
Thank you.
Okay, Paul Champ, you're up, followed by Mira Shukarov and then Rob McKee. Mr. Champ, up to 5 minutes.
Got it, check. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and council members. I'm a proud resident and business owner of downtown Ottawa, and I'm also a lawyer of 25 years and have argued several constitutional cases, including many before the Supreme Court of Canada. I'm also a board member of the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association and have been for over 15 years. And I've been invited to speak before parliamentary committees and have been consulted by the United Nations and Europe's Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights on the right to protest. I'm also, paradoxically, the lawyer who obtained an injunction 3 years ago against the Freedom Convoy protesters when those protests crossed the line. So, but despite that, I'm here to speak against this bylaw. I think it's a bad idea to move it forward, and I've got 3 points to make. First, I'm going to speak about the importance of protests and why. 2, I want to talk about existing tools of enforcement. And third, about abortion access zone bylaws. We heard from Mr. Sandler, so I'll just tell you a little bit about those laws and provide a bit of extra context. So first, importance to right to protest. What we're talking about is charter rights of freedom of expression, freedom of association, and freedom of peaceful assembly. Freedom of expression is being able to express your political opinions. We all have that fundamental freedom. But freedom of association is when we work collectively with other people to amplify our voices, and we cherish that in democracy. Peaceful assembly is then when we come together, those people in a special place. So sometimes the place where you can express those opinions together with other people must be protected. Too often, protests are seen as an inconvenience or an annoyance. But we have to understand that we should be embracing protests and understand that when people come together and organize together to collectively, it's an inherently good thing in a democracy. And if we truly believe in democratic values, we need to respect and protect the right to protest. Public streets. Public streets are the quintessential venue for protests. The courts have said that repeatedly, including the Ontario Court of Appeal, saying political protests and demonstrations are in public streets are, quote, where expression of many varieties have long been accepted. And then the other issue you're dealing with is protests that make people uncomfortable. And you've already heard and discussed, when protests make people uncomfortable. Well, the Ontario Court of Appeal has addressed that as well. Speaking generally, protests that are loud and angry, and which make some people feel uncomfortable, or in some cases even feel unsafe, without more, do not justify laws or prohibitions. The Ontario Court of Appeal has held, quote, a person's subjective feelings of disquiet, unease, and even fear are not in themselves capable of ousting expression from the protection of Section 2 of the Charter. That's from Bracken v. Fort Erie, 2017. So the key here, council members, is that when you're going to restrict charter rights, these are our most fundamental freedoms, and you need to do so based on an evidentiary record. 2, about tools already exist to deal with protests that amount to unreasonable interference. We already have criminal code, we have bylaws, and we have injunctions, as you know. So respectfully, I think if we've got issues with problematic protests, it's an enforcement problem, not a law problem, as we observed in the Freedom Convoy. Third and finally, I know I've got 1 minute, but I think I can just quickly address the preventative issue. It's true that we have safe access laws, both in British Columbia and Ontario, and a few other provinces have adopted them. But the evidentiary record upon which those laws were based and what triggered them, you heard Mr. Sandler speak about them. Respectfully, while it has been quite abhorrent, some of the things we've seen happening at Jewish schools in Toronto and in a synagogue in Montreal, it's not comparable to what was happening with abortion clinics between 1987 and 1994 when those laws first started being introduced. There were serious acts of vandalism. Patients and staff were being directly accosted. There's blocking access to the actual physical doors. Protesters were taking photos of women as they were trying to enter abortion clinics to seek those medical services. There was conspicuous recording of license plates of vehicles. There was also sidewalk counseling, which is they'd create a barrier, a corridor of protesters that women had to walk between to get to the door. And finally, these protests were going on a daily basis, every single day for years. And what triggered those laws was then when it escalated to serious violence, when an abortion doctor was shot in Vancouver. That's what triggered the laws. We don't have that evidentiary record here. We certainly don't have it in Ottawa. And notwithstanding some of the problematic issues we have with some of the protests, respectfully, I don't think a bylaw that chills expression and is preventative in nature is appropriate, especially in our nation's capital.
It's your time.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, sir. We do have some questions for you. Sorry to jump in there, but
that's fine.
Trying to be fair for everyone. So Councillor Troster and then Johnson.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for being here. And thank you for stopping the horns during the convoy. We all cheered. Thank you to you and Zach Seeley.
Someone from City Hall saying that. It's great. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So here's where I'm struggling. I agree with you. I think my biggest concern with the motion that's on the table from Councillor Hill is giving police or bylaw the subjective power to determine what a nuisance is. To me, that's a extreme gray area. But I'm wondering what you think of the approach of having a set perimeter of 50 meters, let's say. So that would effectively be across the street, and something that guaranteed safe access, stripping the language of a nuisance out completely, and have it be standard, not made on a subjective, not a decision made on a subjective basis. Would you see that as being more within line of our constitutional responsibilities, or do you still think that that would be problematic from a human rights perspective?
I still think that would be problematic. You know, and I've attended some of those protests, counter protests, you know, at Broadview School and so forth, where, you know, it's uncomfortable to a certain degree, but I still don't think that a blanket law is appropriate. You know, even under the provincial law in Ontario, our safe access, it identifies only 8 specific clinics. And if other facilities, other hospitals that are being subjected to protests because of abortions, they have to apply to the province to get a special designation. Similarly, doctors' homes, because some people will protest at their homes, which incidentally, this law wouldn't apply to, this bylaw, also have to apply. So the difficulty is a blanket bylaw, in my opinion. Not only do I think it will be found to be unconstitutional, incidentally, but the problem is that it creates a chilling effect towards protests. It just sends a message that in our city, protests aren't welcome, or only certain kinds of protests in certain kinds of places. And I think that we need to recognize that, you know, we need to tolerate a certain degree of you know, noisy, loud protests, even when we disagree with them, especially when we disagree with them. And when protests cross the line, we take proper enforcement action. Okay.
My understanding is in Toronto, what's being contemplated is 50 meters and on an application basis. I do not believe that the nuisance consideration is being placed in there. So anyway, I appreciate your feedback. I think we're all struggling. I mean, I agree with you. I would prefer if the city didn't have to deal with this completely. I actually think there's existing laws that are probably not being enforced. But I also recognize the issue of safe access and the fact that certainly downtown, where we have so many demonstrations, on one hand, I think anything that's blanket, I mean, you couldn't walk anywhere in a rally because there'd be a daycare or a you know, a medical facility or a religious institution on every corner. But I do think the issue of somehow guaranteeing access might be something worth looking at, and that's where I'm struggling. So I appreciate your perspective very much.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Johnson and then Devine.
Thank you for being here. So I wonder, are there currently laws that exist that would cover off safe access for vulnerable institutions, or would a bubble bylaw looking at safe access address a gap that exists?
In terms of preventative bylaws, not in Ottawa, but there's other options, right? Like, this is the thing, is what's happening in Ottawa, that's the real problem. I read that city staff brief, and there was a citing of one article of issues in Ottawa. If we have, you know, truly pernicious types of protests at a particular location, Another option is just getting an injunction around that site. You know, the safe access law that we have for abortions in Ontario, that was only introduced in 2017. And for 20 years, we had a standing injunction protecting the abortion clinic. So if we have a particular issue here in Ottawa, if there's one location, one religious school, retirement home, schools that are flying, the trans flags and whatnot, where the protests have been shown to be particularly objectionable, we can get an injunction around that site.
Thank you. And I was wondering, so when you talk about an evidentiary record required in order to meet what our city solicitor described as sort of the first test of charter protection or lawfulness under the charter, which was good faith, is the evidentiary record required within the city that bylaw would apply, or is it to look at other municipalities and to look at, other levels of government? What would count as evidence?
In my opinion, it would have to be Ottawa-based. The Calgary challenge, so the Calgary Safe Inclusive Site, there has been one provincial court decision, and what the city there led for evidence was a single expert saying, yeah, people who are going to these places will feel uncomfortable. And that was upheld actually by that provincial court judge, in fairness. But that case is on appeal, and there's a separate charter challenge separately that is going to the Court of Queen's Bench that is going after that bylaw. And respectfully, I think that that evidentiary record is far too slim. I think if it was to be defended here in Ottawa, you'd need evidence about what are the specific issues here in Ottawa that have triggered or caused the bylaw to be adopted.
Okay, and I was also wondering if you could give me your legal interpretation of the second test that the city solicitor had put forward, which was, forgive me because I'm not as familiar with it, but an impediment on federal or provincial existing what? Like what is that? Can you describe for me what that is and what it means?
Yeah, it's whether is the law going so far that it's infringing on federal jurisdiction? Is this like a criminal law power? Are you trying to interfere with something that is truly federal in nature, like the criminal law power? I think you guys are probably safe on that. That's my opinion. I think that there's already been charter challenges, for example, where some cities have passed bylaws around street solicitation, and those were challenged, saying, hey, prostitution, this was back in the day before Bedford, prostitution is prohibiting it as a criminal law power, but the courts upheld that as a proper municipal bylaw because the cars and so forth were in fact causing a property nuisance in those areas. And so the bylaw was held to be constitutional in that sense. So I think it would survive that.
So in respect to C3 that the federal government passed that protects, that looked at the criminal code around hospitals and around sort of anti-vaccination protests, that's the one I'm wondering, with hospitals being included in this motion, would we have a vulnerability for a charter challenge if hospitals were protected in that motion?
My opinion is I think you'd be okay. I think because you can have laws that are touching the same areas and overlapping in the same areas, as I was saying in the example of the prostitution bylaw, obviously that there's the laws at that time criminalizing street solicitation, but then the bylaw was prohibiting the cars and so forth. So there was bylaws and criminal law power. They're sort of governing the same activity, and the courts found that to be constitutional. So I'm, in the federal provincial jurisdiction issue, and I think you'd be all right.
Okay, thank you for your comments.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Devine.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Champ, for being here. And thank you 2 years ago for coming to the defense of our city's best interests, and thank you today for coming to the defense of our city's best interests. And I'm going to agree, I'm going to assume that you are a far better expert on constitutional matters and what makes a strong democracy than I am. You were talking quite powerfully to me about the inherent value of some of our charter rights. And you were talking about freedom of expression and how that leads to freedom of association and therefore freedom of assembly. So whereas we are talking about those charter rights as being items that provide benefits to the people themselves, benefits to individuals, but would you not agree that those charter rights are also the foundational blocks of what makes a strong democracy?
Well, that's why they're called the fundamental freedoms. Freedom of expression and freedom of association and peaceful assembly is how we interact with each other and with our government. Democracy doesn't begin and end by dropping a ballot in the ballot box, right? It's an interactive process, like what we're hearing today. You know, it's wonderful. All these people making excellent points on all sides of the topic, and council members listening respectfully. It's terrific. This is democracy in action. But in some cases, people do go to the streets. Often it's the more vulnerable population, the more marginalized population, people who don't have other access to power, who aren't being heard. You know, the COVID people who were opposed to the vaccines or out of work, who came here for Freedom Convoy, I was sympathetic to how those people felt, you know, and that they had reasons why they wanted to protest, and you know, good for them for organizing to come together and protest. Unfortunately, the way they protested was problematic and was very disrespectful and seriously interfered with the lives of Ottawa residents, as we all know. But the idea that people coming together collectively is an inherent good, that's what we need to understand. So even though you know, I could not disagree more with those people who are out at Broadview School, who have gone and disrupted at times some of our school board meetings and so forth, or you know, some of the fringes of the convoy that we see down there in Wellington Street, out in front of Langevin Block all the time. But that's democracy. You know, those people are speaking out, expressing their opinions, working, you know, associating together, and we need to respect and embrace that rather than think this is an annoyance. That's democracy, right? And if we don't respect that, I don't think we're respecting democracy.
Thank you. And to stay on the subject of respecting and embracing democracy for a little bit more here, I would agree with you that, you know, protest is one of the beautiful elements of what makes a strong democracy. We are seeing, sadly, the erosion of democracy with our neighbor to the south. But going back to my point, if those charter rights are the foundational blocks of what makes a strong democracy, is it not therefore fair to say that by, no pun intended, putting some bubble wrap around some of our institutions, and anything that goes forward that may put restrictions on those charter rights, does that not therefore start to erode the strength of our democracy?
Well, I think it's just the idea of a blanket zone. Like, if I wasn't clear before, I actually support those safe access abortion laws. Given what was happening, you know, some of us, you've seen even with the bubble zone up there on a bank and close to Sparks, the people 100 meters away, and they're there every single day. And so, you know, if we have a situation where there's some people out there, either in front of a school or a synagogue, every single day harassing kids, that's a different thing. You know, and the same thing, the Freedom Convoy protest. If those characters that came here and driven their trucks around one day or even for the weekend, that probably would have been okay. But if a protest becomes particularly pernicious, we should address it. But I just don't think we see that in Ottawa right now. I don't think we're seeing that kind of a problem.
Thank you. You made, I'm not sure if this was your quote or if you were quoting precedent, but you were talking about how public streets are the quintessential place for protests. And I do believe in that opinion, because those public streets are often the only place that the people can gather. They might not be able to get a permit for a booking hall or whatever, but that element about public streets being the quintessential place for protests, is that found in laws that you cited?
Yes,
something?
absolutely. Yes, I was absolutely. That's found as Court of Appeal. I was quoting there. I didn't mention it, but I was hearing earlier. I was hearing that Section 16 of that other bylaw you guys are considering. You know, and the selective policing that we've been seeing with respect to the Palestinian protests, get on the street, get off the street. A union leader was arrested and charged in this city for being at a strike with you know, on the street. Like, I mean, streets are not just for cars. I know people don't seem to remember that, but streets are for protests. And you know, if it's a bit of an inconvenience for cars at times, that's acceptable, right? Blocking a street for days, that's obviously a problem. But a march up the street that takes like 2 hours or 3 hours, like what we're seeing on Saturdays, that's protest. That's quintessential. That's classic demonstrations.
Thank you. You were also citing another, I think you were citing some other case or precedent about the nature of feelings. And I think the comment you had is that a person's subjective feeling of being afraid, their feeling of being intimidated, those are not
It's not enough.
That's not enough, but nor do we have laws to protect people's feelings of being intimidated or feelings of being afraid. Is that correct?
Correct.
So on that point, I think we all agree that there is a very, very fundamental difference between someone acting in an intimidating manner and someone being intimidated by someone who may not be acting in any intimidating manner at all.
Mhm.
Would it be your opinion that should we be putting in place laws that are meant, it's fine to put in place laws to protect people from intimidation, but should we be putting in place laws to protect people from feeling intimidated if there is no active intimidation happening in place?
Right. I mean, that's why your city staff, obviously I know that they reviewed the jurisprudence, and that's why in the proposal they say, would a reasonable person feel
Yeah.
intimidated? They're no doubt they've read that jurisprudence and have tried to address that. But that's there's no question. Some people are always going to feel uncomfortable with a protest.
Yeah.
That case that I was talking about out of Fort Erie, what was happening is one guy was particularly upset with the city council there in Fort Erie, and he was standing out in front of the city hall with a sign protesting and yelling every day, and the city staff were feeling intimidated. But on the evidence then, it was just they were feeling intimidated, and he was saying some offensive stuff, but he wasn't actually threatening anyone. He wasn't yelling any discriminatory remarks or anything like that. And it's like, and so the Court of Appeal was saying, yeah, some people might have subjectively felt uncomfortable, and some may have subjectively felt unsafe, but that wasn't enough.
I agree with you. My last question, you were talking about how any kind of bylaw, and you said any kind of bylaw that might chill freedom of expression, and even the concept, chills me, but any kind of bylaw that might chill freedom of expression should not necessarily be seen as preventative. But would it be fair to say that that kind of bylaw that chills freedom of expression, might that be even seen as oppressive?
Well, yeah, Councillor, here's one thing that has upset me a lot since the Freedom Convoy is that there's a lot of people saying that the people of Ottawa are against protests. Do you know what I mean? That we're hostile to protests. And that's not the Ottawa that I've seen and known living downtown Ottawa for 20 years. We've had large, huge protests, sometimes 10, 20,000, 30, 40,000. Every year I see the anti-abortion protests. They march right by my office. And I'm like, great, that's a peaceful protest. They're going up to Parliament Hill. I completely disagree with them, but they're coming to Ottawa. And I think we should celebrate that in Ottawa. We're the national place of protest, and we should be. And I don't want Ottawa to be reinforcing that false image that somehow we're against protests. We should be welcoming and embracing protests, making it safe, which our police often are very good at. You'll see them when there's counter protests. I know they're very good at keeping the groups separate, but allowing them to say their views. And that's what Ottawa should be out. We shouldn't be putting forward an experimental bylaw. It's an experimental bylaw. Why should Ottawa be leading here? Let's see what happens with the Brampton bylaw, the Vaughan bylaw, the Calgary bylaw, because I'll tell you this, if Ottawa adopts this bylaw, it's not a question of if that bylaw will be challenged, it's when. And I just don't see the problem why we would want to, as the nation's capital, be saying, we're somehow sending the message that we don't support the right to protest.
Thank you. And I'm glad, I think you're the first person that mentioned that, we are talking about Ottawa as the seat of democracy. And let's not, try to impede the value of democracy here in the seat of democracy. The last question I want to ask you, I just want to get you, because I've been asking questions about my own concerns there, but I want to speak to the motion that is before us. Can you speak to the reason so Councillor Hill, who has brought the motion to review a bubble bylaw, can you speak to the reason he has provided that this is a reasonable infringement on freedom of expression to protect others' rights? Can you tell me what you think of that argument?
Well, I mean, as the case that I brought forward on behalf of Ottawa residents and businesses and workers, protests can't unreasonably interfere with the rights of others, for sure. And there are lines that can be crossed. Completely blocking people, if you're completely blocking people, that's unacceptable. Temporary delays are okay. Completely blocking people, threats and so forth is completely unacceptable. That's not speech. That's not protected speech. Pardon me, it's speech, but not protected speech. And my point is that we need a record to deal with it. And if those kinds of activities are happening, we already have the tools there to deal with that kind of behavior, and we shouldn't be coming up with preventative laws that send a message that we don't like protests or we only like certain protests in certain places.
I agree with you completely. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. And Councillor Kelly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your delegation today. I'm wondering, is it you spent a lot of time talking about protests generally and mentioned explicitly, people walking past your office to go to Parliament Hill. You mentioned people who continuously protest outside of the Prime Minister's office. Don't believe it's called Langevin Block anymore, but I do believe that you mentioned that. So I don't believe that, and of course, you mentioned that we should be maybe not encouraging, but certainly allowing for protests. And I don't believe anyone who's supportive of Councillor Hill's motion would disagree with that. But since you've mentioned Parliament Hill a number of times, are you suggesting that that is also vulnerable infrastructure? Because I would see that those are great places for protests. That's where decisions are made that affect people's lives. And wondering why you've used those examples today instead of other examples.
The reason why I use those examples in the Parliament Hill example at Langevin Block is that protests that are prolonged, that go multiple days or even weeks, that can cross the line into problematic and unlawful protests. And we have seen some of these fringe people from the Freedom Convoy who stayed and are there every day. You can see them near the War Memorial or Langevin Block. It's the same group of about 4 to 8 or 12 people. I think one of them actually did get charged there 6 months ago or 8 months ago for threatening an MP. And I think they've all been blocked now from entering any of the Parliament buildings. But my point was just that they're there all the time. You go down there and you hear them, and you kind of go, "Oh, that's kind of irritating," but that's democracy. If they were more aggressive, even though those Parliament Hill is a place of protest where politicians are, I think that they would result in charges. I don't think we'd want a bubble zone, obviously, ever around Parliament Hill.
No, of course
but
not.
If that conduct got more aggressive than it is, and those folks walk the line, they do. The police are very good. They're careful. They're watching them, and sometimes some of them get arrested. But it's that kind of protest that goes on day after day. We're even starting to getting into the problematic territory, in my view.
Yeah, like I said, though, I do believe, and I think you're in agreement with that those are appropriate places for protests. I struggle with protests around schools. My mind often goes to, and we've spent a lot of time today talking about physical intimidation. I remember very explicitly lots of scenes on TV during the pandemic where, nurses and healthcare practitioners walking into hospitals or healthcare settings are being screamed at about World Economic Forum and all kinds of conspiracy theory nonsense. And of course, I would not want to be in their position doing that. And I'm aware that there are, now there are statutes in place to prevent that. But I guess I'll ask you the same question that I asked a previous delegate in terms of, if you were protesting something that was happening in and around or to a school, how would being 100 meters away from the requirement to be what some people, including myself, might consider an appropriate distance from a place like that, how does that limit or in a meaningful way your freedom of expression?
Yeah, well, first of all, it'd be pretty special circumstance where I'd feel I'd want to go and protest at a school. I've gone to a counter protest just because there was concerns about the protest going on. And, make no mistake, that doesn't mean I support ideas of people protesting at places of worship or so forth. I don't on a personal basis. But what happens when you create like a zone like that, it's about who's hearing the message. Sometimes the location of a protest is what matters. So for example, an Indigenous protest on a particular road because that road goes into traditional territory or something, that's different than protesting, downtown and on Kent Street that has nothing to do with government. So that it's about who is hearing the message. People can walk away from the message, but it's about where you're expressing the opinion is sometimes as important as the opinion being expressed.
And I take your point that it is important, but can you honestly say that it would stop you from expressing yourself?
It's, well, in the same way, if we create, or if the, if the police continue to enforce that no one should be marching on streets, right? Or the same thing with Mr. Bracken in the Fort Erie case. He was allowed to keep protesting if he wanted, but what the city hall there wanted was him not protesting on city hall grounds. And the idea there was that, it's who's going to hear the opinion if you're not in a particular location. So that's why when I was talking about peaceful assembly, sometimes where you protest is significant or an important part of the message.
Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Councillor Devine.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Champ, I just had one follow-up question. In so many cities, so much new legislation is being passed, and here in Ottawa, we're trying to learn and perhaps determine where we might go based on precedent. And I know that one of my colleagues asked you a question about would you be amenable, I suppose the word is, if certainly not to the concept currently proposed with outlawing any kind of nuisance protest, but would you be more amenable to any kind of restrictions that focus exclusively on safe access? And you said you're not so much supportive of that, and I understand. The question I want to ask you, one item that just passed in Toronto, thank you. One item that is being considered in Toronto, and I'm just learning of this, very recently, is that rather than a citywide concept of a bubble zone be applied, that a bubble zone could be applied in a specific instance to a specific location if that location had experienced some form of protest that has clear acts of intimidation within the last X number of days.
Yeah.
And so it'd be an evidence-based decision that one would have to say, you know what, we need this, not for a preventative measure because of what might happen one day, because that person might go crazy, but we need this because of what happened last week. So in that kind of instance, would you be more amenable to that kind of?
I certainly would. I think that would address a lot of issues. Absolutely, that where there's an application saying, here's what's happened.
Yeah.
These folks are coming again next weekend. We're worried. Here's the things that happened. Here's some of the things that people were saying.
Yep.
We would like for a zone. And as I say, under the Ontario law for abortion spaces, that is an option, is that different medical facilities or individuals who are staff at abortion service locations, they can apply to get a bubble zone around their homes or around other locations. So with an application process, that would definitely make the bylaw far more reasonable and defensible from a constitutional perspective.
Thank you, because I think what we are hopefully striving for here is something reasonable. So thank you for your opinion on that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Seeing no other colleagues with questions, thank you very much for your delegation today. Okay, Mira Shukarov, Rob McKee, and then Sam Hirsch. Is Ms. She's being promoted? Okay.
Hello, just having a little tech problems. Am I on?
Is this Ms. Shukarov?
Yes, it is.
All right.
I'm not sure if you can see me. Hello.
Up to 5. Yeah, you have up to 5 minutes.
All right. Thank you, and forgive me for tech problems as I am on Canada's finest via rail. I'm a professor of political science at Carleton University. I speak only for myself, but just to situate myself, I am a Jew who has lived in Ottawa for over 20 years and have lived in Canada most of my life. I also specialize in Israeli-Palestinian relations, and I am on the advisory committee of the Nexus document, which deals with the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, also called the Nexus Task Force. And I'm also on the founding signatory group of the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. I would like to suggest that if a bubble bylaw was passed, that similar to Councillor Devine's recent question about having a contextual exception for needing to introduce perhaps a bubble where one might not otherwise be because of a certain context of time, a time-based context. I would like to suggest something similar, but in the inverse, not to contradict what you suggested, but in sort of in inverse, and that is the following. If a faith-based or cultural-based organization is sponsoring or hosting on their premises an event that has implications for human rights, international law, politics, or policy, especially foreign policy, that the bubble perhaps nullified and voided for that day and perhaps the day prior, something like that. And what I'm seeing here is there's a real tension between the idea of protesting, and I think a stark line has to be drawn between protesting Jewish institutions because one is angry at Israel. I think that is unacceptable, and I think that is anti-Semitic to implicate Jews in Canada just because they are Jews. At the same time, if a Jewish institution is hosting a volunteer event or recruiting volunteers to assist the Israel Defense Forces, as has happened in our community here. A similar event was held recently in the Jewish community campus in Winnipeg, where they were hosting 2 soldiers from the IDF. And another event happened at a Los Angeles synagogue where there was a real estate fair being held where plots of land in settlements were being sold. In all 3 cases, there were protests, and the problem is that some communities viewed those protests as anti-Semitic, and they would want such a bubble law. They don't want their community's members to experience anti-Semitism, of course, understandably. At the same time, those protests are not protesting Jews qua Jews. They're protesting particular events that have policy, human rights, international law, or political implications. Thank you.
Thank you. Does that conclude your delegation?
Yes, it does.
Okay, thank you. We do have a question for you from my colleague, Councillor Troster.
Hi, Mira. Thanks for being here. I just wanted to clarify because the audio was a little bit tricky in your presentation. So it seems to me that what you're speaking about, which is something that I brought up earlier, is the issue is when a meeting of a political nature is held in a faith institution. So protesting that political meeting is not protesting the faith institution, it's protesting what's happening inside. Is that the point you're making?
The other events. So that protesting it that day or the day before would be appropriate, but protesting that faith institution every week because they held an event last night would not be appropriate.
Okay, thank you. I just want to say I appreciate that. I think that's what some of us are trying to figure out because organizations use these buildings for all sorts of things. And I think, another example is, I don't know, if just as you mentioned, if a faith institution is hosting a recruitment event for a foreign army, that's fundamentally a political event that is different from a religious service. And so my understanding actually now looking at the language is that I think that's something that folks are trying to contend with in the motion. So I appreciate you bringing that forward. Thank you.
May I just respond with one little small point? I'm not sure if that makes you have more minutes, but the tricky thing is communities have campuses as also other places where the institution hosting it might be a Jewish federation. It would probably not be home for the aged, the nursing home, but the nursing home is on the campus, similarly preschool. But maybe that is to say that if Jewish communities are going to host something political, that they have to perhaps rethink the role of being a faith-based organization, perhaps. And this is tricky, of course. I mean, I guess the question is if they were to host it on site, is there are they still a legitimate target for peaceful protest after that? That would be the other question.
Okay, I'm gonna repeat what you said just because the audio was really tricky to make sure that it's well understood. So you're saying that the protest that we've heard about that was near the Jewish retirement, near the Hillel Lodge, was targeting a military recruitment event or an event to sell land that was at the JCC, which happened to be right beside the retirement home. So the concern you're raising is if you put the bubble around the retirement home, would that then prevent legitimate protests against a meeting of a political nature at the Jewish Community Center?
I'm saying that I'm also wondering if the Jewish Community Center or a Jewish community was going to host an event, that the event were to take place off site somewhere else. But if the Jewish Community Center, let's say, that was hosting it, sponsoring it, maybe not in their physical building, would the site of the JCC be a fair game for a peaceful protest? And that I'm not sure. That gets tricky.
Okay, thank you. Yes, it is very tricky.
Thank you, Councillor Troster. Chair Attorney has a question as well.
Yeah, I'll just be brief. My colleague has far better hearing than I can. I didn't hear a damn word of that. Can you submit a written copy of that, just so we have a copy of that to review? Would that be okay? The answer to the question that Ariel reiterated. I missed a lot of the what you had said there. We couldn't hear you too well.
Certainly, and I apologize for the poor reception. I'll send something. I'll send it to Councillor Troster and she'll forward it to you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much for your delegation today. We appreciate it. Thanks very much. Next, we have Rob McKee, followed by Sam Hirsch, and then Robin Brown. And Mr. McKee, I see you online. Welcome
I'm
to
here.
you.
Thank you.
Excellent. You have up to 5 minutes.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I always know this. Someone gives you 5 minutes, take 3. My name is Rob. I'm lead pastor of Bikers Church and part of the great community of Vanier, along with Stephanie Plant. I think she would agree with me. A great community. And I'm fully supportive of what's happening with this bylaw going forward. I've had the opportunity to be at some of the protests, usually not by choice. We've been invited by police liaisons to be there to try to make cooler heads prevail at times. And I truly believe a school, not the best place to protest, being at that and experiencing it. I thought, man, what's it like for the students and for the teachers to be part of this? I couldn't imagine my Jewish brothers and sisters having that at their synagogues. We've been fortunate enough. Nobody's been bold enough to come and protest here at Bikers Church. They usually just come in the silent of the night and graffiti our building and do things. So I'm fully supportive of this. I appreciate every single one of you on council and what you're wrestling with. And what I appreciate is none of you are want to squash the right to protest. So I think it is, how do you wrestle that tension to find that safe place where it's not squashing rights, but it's creating that bubble zone that's I think will bring a lot more safety and security to maybe the places and the people being protested against. So I'm all for it. And I love it, and I appreciate each one of you, and know that we pray for every single one of you guys on a weekly basis here at Bikers Church, that God gives you wisdom and discernment as you lead this great city.
Thank you for your delegation. It was 3 minutes. Under 2 minutes. Question from my colleague, Councillor Johnson.
Thank you. I was just wondering which protests the police invited you to.
Numerous ones. So there was ones at the National Arts Center, the one down at Broadview Public School. We work very closely with the liaison officers, and our liaison officer at the time was Derek. He's now back on regular foot patrol, but we would be in constant contact regularly. And so he was the one that invited us down.
All right. Thank you again for your delegation. We appreciate it. Next, we have Sam Hirsch, then Robin Brown, then Sikandar Hashmi. Mr. Hirsch, up to 5 minutes.
Can you hear me? Oh,
Yes.
There we go. Okay, thanks. Thank you for having me here. There are groups here today that will and have tried and made this about one specific issue, and who are being quite selective with whether they are in favor or opposed to where debate and protest should be. But let's be clear, this debate is not about one issue, but about defending our rights and freedoms as it relates to dissent, and any blanket or amended bylaw presented as such, as staff even note, is a risky and slippery slope. Over the last few years, we have seen a rise in hate targeting marginalized folks, including Jewish, Muslim, Palestinian, and queer communities, among others. Across the country, anti-Semitic threats are on the rise. Months ago, a bomb threat was called into multiple Jewish institutions in Montreal. And a few months back, the synagogue in Montreal I grew up close to and attended bar mitzvahs and services at was vandalized. And in Ottawa, since the convoy, we have become no stranger to this as far-right marches continue to target queer and trans folks and spread dangerous conspiracy theories about Jews and Muslims. The rise of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and anti-Palestinian racism, and more, is real. But I want to be clear, and some have mentioned this already, but there is a big difference between real harm and discomfort with opinions you disagree with. And I think this is an important distinction to make in this debate. To lump in and compare protests for international human rights like Palestine, among others, or strikes or labor actions with those hateful anti-trans protests or those harassing people outside abortion clinics and actual anti-Semitic events like the vandalizing of synagogues and bomb threats is entirely wrong and disingenuous. And an example of why the, quote, nuisance demonstration clause as defined is vague, dangerous, and opens it up to abuse by police, bylaw officers, and complaints by members of the public. I think no one would disagree with the need for bubble zones around abortion clinics because they were necessary, as Paul Champ noted earlier. People were quite literally being put into harm's way from accessing life-saving services. In this case, I think distinctions again need to be made. Of course, freedom of religion and freedom of expression are both fundamental charter rights. However, these rights are not in conflict in this case. As the Reverend Dr. Paul Shepard of the United Church of Canada warned at a rally at City Hall in Toronto last month, quote, "If my church did something I disagree with, I think protest would be warranted. And I maybe would want you to come out and protest. And that's not anti-religious," he says, "that's community and that's democracy." Existing laws already offer robust tools to address hate and harassment. What the proposed bylaw would do is preemptively ban peaceful and otherwise lawful protests on public property. And there's a rich history of protests outside of religious institutions. I don't think any of us today would oppose those in the 80s who protested hateful anti-queer bigot Anita Bryant when she spoke at a church in Toronto. But such a bylaw as proposed would disallow that. And recently, when a Vancouver synagogue hosted Pierre Poilievre, members of the synagogue's own congregation gathered outside to protest its stance on trans rights. This too would also be prohibited under, the modeled Vaughan bylaw, among others. Everyone, regardless of religion, should be able to practice in peace and safety. But we cannot be selective of what types of legitimate and peaceful protests we allow at, close to, or around religious institutions, just as we cannot be selective about which opinions from which part of different communities we listen to. No community is a monolith. This is not how legitimate public consultation and debate is done. The mayor talks about, quote, robust consultation that was done with the community, but I would submit, as would many others, that bringing on a rushed motion with little notice, such as the one before us, isn't really consistent with that. And the motion as such is not a debate about whether or not we should support a bubble bylaw, but, quote, what type of bubble bylaw we should support. The debate is over even before it begins. I have spoken, for example, to the executive directors of both Planned Parenthood Ottawa and Capital Pride. Both said they were not properly consulted about this motion or bylaw. Seems to me that consulting one of the most important groups for the queer community, as well as one that actually has experience with bubble zones such as PPO, would be of utmost importance, but I suppose perhaps not. Why are we putting a greater, and lastly, why are we putting a greater workload on an already overburdened staff when this bylaw has never even been tested in the courts and may just ultimately end up being thrown out anyways?
1 minute.
Thank you. Councillors, I am asking you, as others have done before me, to do the responsible thing here and proceed with more caution and transparency like is described in Councillor Devine's motion. A bylaw of this magnitude should not be rushed because certain groups say that it should be. Listen to the community, oppose the motion from Councillor Hill, and ensure that our guaranteed rights are protected. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hirsch. We do have a question for you from Councillor Troster.
Hi, Sam. Thanks for being here. Your point is well taken. I think what you're hearing is a lot of us really trying to dig into the core of what some of us find really objective or objectionable. In Councillor Hill's motion, all good intentions aside, I think my main concern is having bylaw or police make a subjective determination of what a nuisance is. My understanding is that Toronto is now looking at something that's application-based, that's time-limited, and that's only 50 meters, which would essentially be across the street. And the goal is safe access, not prevention of nuisance. I'm just wondering how you feel about that perspective, because in talking to some folks, it seems that that's something that I can live with. I have to tell you, I struggle with the schools issue. You were at Broadview Public School, so was I. That one is really tough, and that one is very obviously a school that's being persistently targeted. I know Mr. Champ said an injunction is an option, but you know, I'm at the point where I'm like, how often do we have to do this physical defense with our bodies? Is there a better alternative? And so I am very torn. And I also have serious concerns about constitutional issues. So what do you think of a more surgical approach that focuses on access, and a bubble that is really not very far away? It is still within hearing and seeing distance of any institution.
I appreciate the question. You know, I'm not sure necessarily about the effectiveness of bubble bylaws. Maybe some others who come after and speak here later can speak to that more definitively. But you know, I did hear about the Toronto bylaw. They just put it forward today, if I'm not correct. Though I will say I do prefer the divine motion, because I do think it is a more cautious approach, and we'll go with what staff are saying. I mean, we, like I said, and like many others have said before me, none of these have been tested in court yet. Who knows what will happen in 9, 10 months, a year from now, right? So I think it would be better for the city and for everyone else to actually do legitimate consultations with people about whether or not not what type of bubble bylaw we should have, but whether or not we should have one at all. Because I don't think there has been a veracity of public consultations. Maybe some people have been consulted, but like I just said, Planned Parenthood Ottawa wasn't consulted. The executive director and Capital Pride wasn't properly consulted. And you know, I think before we move into this conversation about what kind of bubble bylaw, we should move into this public consultation about whether or not we should actually have one at all.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And just to be clear, if this motion or a revised, more surgical version of this motion passed, it would trigger a 9-month consultation process. And then there would be another vote if a bylaw was produced. So I also just wanted to let folks know that, like, this is still just another step in the process. But I hear you, and I've expressed public support for Councillor Devine's motion. But I think in the world of politics, we're also thinking about contingencies and compromises, and you can't please everyone all the time. But I think we're trying to solve a real problem here. So I appreciate your perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hirsch, for your presentation, your delegation. It's appreciated. Robin Brown is next, and I believe Mr. Brown is online. Is that correct?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can. You have up to 5 minutes.
Excellent. Thank you, Chair. Agenda item 3.1 included proposed changes to the noise bylaw, including the use of sound amplification devices at demonstrations. Staff recommended against changes, stating that, quote, current regulations and enforcement practices concerning the use of sound amplification devices at demonstrations are reasonable and justifiable in accordance with Section 1 of the Charter, unquote. That staff feel current enforcement practices concerning sound amplification devices at demonstrations are reasonable and justifiable raises concerns given the city is considering implementing a bubble protest bylaw. Regarding the proposed bubble protest bylaw, staff has said, quote, although the need to protect the human rights, safety, and well-being of residents, as well as to preserve their access to social infrastructure, is pressing and substantial, staff recommend that a comprehensive review and consultation process be undertaken to ensure proportionality before enacting a bylaw that would restrict protest activity, unquote. Now, we're concerned about ensuring that such a review is evidence-based when staff think everything is great regarding enforcement, despite the ample evidence to the contrary. We all lived through the Freedom Convoy in February 2022. 3 weeks of blockades, harassment, disruption, and blaring horns until Paul Champ got involved, with little to no enforcement and no talk of a bubble bylaw then. Not a single councillor proposed creating protest exclusion zones around Parliament Hill or downtown businesses. But when marginalized voices speak up, when we gather in support of trans rights, Palestinian rights, or against institutional violence like the police, city bylaw and Ottawa police swoop down and enforce with a vengeance and really big fines, and suddenly a bubble bylaw is on the table. The evidence also shows there are plenty of laws on the books that regulate harassment, intimidation, and obstruction, laws that the Ottawa Police and Bylaw Services can and should use when needed. The real issue isn't a lack of legislation, it's unequal enforcement. We see it time and again. Who gets protected and who gets punished depends on not on what's done, but who is doing it and to whom. The bubble bylaw would only add another tool to that unequal toolbox. So let's be honest. The proposed bubble bylaw is about suppressing dissent and fits into a broader pattern we've seen from this city, like the Ottawa Police Services Board's restrictions on public delegations, restrictions we're taking to court with a trial starting next Tuesday. That's the kind of overreach we're talking about. Bylaws, motions, and procedures used not to protect people, but to silence them. The proposed bubble bylaw isn't about safety, it's about control. Now, staff say access laws for abortion services have established a foundation for potential regulations, but even the good bubble zone bylaws end up being used in harmful ways. They're also enforced selectively, and too often, people who end up fined or arrested are already vulnerable, poor, racialized, disabled, and queer people. That's not protection. That's punishment dressed up in progressive language. And let's be clear, this proposed bubble bylaw would be a direct violation of the charter rights to freedom of expression and freedom of peaceful assembly, rights that do not disappear just because a protest makes someone uncomfortable. Protest is supposed to be uncomfortable. That's how change happens. Martin Luther King and his supporters engaged in nonviolent protests that made a lot of people uncomfortable. To those of you supporting this bylaw, we say this: you don't get to criminalize voices you don't like. You don't get to decide which causes are too disruptive and which are acceptable. That's not democracy. That's authoritarianism. We will continue to protest, we will continue to show up, and we will continue to speak out. Because as much as the actions of some of you show that you want us to just shut up and die, I'm here to tell you that we will do neither. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. I will look to my colleagues. I do not see any hands up at this time. Thank you very much for your delegation today. It's appreciated. Sikander Hashmi, followed by Michael Polowin, and then Karen Baker Anderson. And Mr. Hashmi, I see you online, sir. You have up to 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Are you able to hear me well? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to start off by thanking Councillor Hill, Councillor Devine, indeed, all the councillors and all the delegations for such a rich debate. It's certainly a lot of food for thought, a lot to think over. So thank you very much for that. My name is Sikander Hashmi. I serve as an imam in Canada and also happen to serve as the executive director of the Canadian Council of Imams. I'm speaking today in my personal capacity as a faith leader, a resident of Ottawa, and someone committed to fostering justice, respect, and safety for all people in our city. The current state, I have to say, the current state of pain, fear, and divisiveness in our city really breaks my heart. Because, throughout my years of service, I have consistently stood against all forms of hate, whether it's Islamophobia, racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, which is real, it's dangerous, and it's deeply wrong. I have publicly condemned it in the past, and I do so again today. And no one should feel unsafe because of their faith, their identity, or background, and that includes very much my Jewish neighbors. That is a principle I've always held dear and defended publicly without hesitation. I also firmly believe that all people should have safe access to their community institutions, and that is why, to me, the stated goal of the proposed vulnerable social infrastructure bylaw that we're discussing appears to be commendable: to protect places of worship and schools, hospitals, long-term care facilities from harassment and obstruction. These are sacred and essential spaces for communities, and safeguarding them serves the public good, in my opinion. That being said, it would be disingenuous of me not to openly and respectfully share serious concerns surrounding such bylaws that have been raised by many people across a range of communities, including some of those that I represent. Such proposals arise in the context of recent protests outside some particular places of worship in other Canadian cities, and to my knowledge, the protests were not directed at worship or faith practices, but rather at public events which were being held in those or within those institutions. For example, and I know that this has been alluded to earlier, but some events, for example, promoted the sale of properties in Israel, including those located in Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. These were not religious services, they were commercial events, publicly advertised and open to the public. Canada's official position, as you may know, is unambiguous that Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank are considered illegal under international law and are widely regarded as a major obstacle to peace. And moreover, numerous human rights organizations, along with the United Nations, have raised alarm about rising levels of settler violence in the West Bank, acts which have included physical assaults and destruction of property, intimidation of Palestinian families. And these are not isolated incidents, unfortunately, but part of a growing and disturbing pattern. So for many Canadians, particularly Palestinians who are Muslim as well as Christian, Indigenous peoples, and others who have whose families have experienced displacement or colonization, these events are not just political or symbolic, but they are deeply personal. They evoke lived experiences of injustice and loss. And when these real estate expos are hosted in Canadian cities, they are seen as legitimizing actions that much of the world regards as unlawful and unethical. Another local event, which I think has been mentioned earlier, was recruiting volunteers to live on foreign military bases and provide support to a foreign army alleged to be engaged in serious international human rights violations. The event was at a community center directly across from a long-term care facility housing seniors. So how do we as a community navigate controversial events? If community groups book divisive speakers or activities in or near places of worship or schools or long-term care facilities, to me, that seems unfair for our most vulnerable. So I'm calling upon our leaders, faith leaders and beyond, to consider what division is doing to our community and how we can avoid it. But let me be absolutely clear. There is no room, of course, for hateful comments or actions, including during protests, whether it targets faith, ethnicity, or identity. The concern, however, is that such bylaws may increasingly be used to suppress legitimate protests, discouraging Canadians from engaging in peaceful, conscience-driven expression on matters of human rights and justice. Furthermore, vulnerable infrastructure could be used to shield controversial and divisive activities from legitimate and charter-protected forms of scrutiny. That would represent a dangerous precedent and one that could erode public trust in our democratic institutions. If you still decide to move ahead with this motion, I urge you and staff to proceed only with sincere, robust, broad-based consultation that involves faith leaders, human rights advocates, civil liberties organizations, legal experts, and members of the public who may be affected, concerned about this bylaw, especially those from communities whose voices are too often excluded from policymaking tables. The process must address important questions. For example, should this bylaw include spaces when they are being used for purposes other than their primary function? Is there even a need for such a bylaw, or could the issues be addressed by simply applying existing legislation fairly and consistently? Or perhaps, since it is difficult to define nuisance and non-physical harm and intimidation, could the bylaw be limited to schools only to protect our most vulnerable?
I'm just going to jump in here, Mr. Hashmi. I'm just going to jump in because your time has elapsed. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, I'm done. I just wanted to pray for the safety of all my fellow citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. I do have a colleague who has a question for you, Councillor Gower.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for sharing your perspective. I appreciate it. I think we all do. I think you were finished, but were there any other significant points that you wanted to share with the committee?
I'm sorry, Councillor Gower. No, that's not appropriate. If you have questions about the content that we've heard thus far, you can ask a question of clarification, but you don't get to ask a question for the delegate to speak further.
Okay, well, I'll ask a follow-up. I think one of the key things I heard there was that rather than proceeding with a bubble bylaw and simultaneous consultation, your advice to committee is to do a more robust round of consultation and engagement first before we make any start on developing a bylaw. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll be clear. So when I look at the motion and when I look at it in isolation, it sounds pretty reasonable to me, right? Because of course I want safety for everyone. At the same time, though, I think there are some very legitimate concerns that have been raised by the delegations that have spoken today, and from things that I'm hearing from within my community. And therefore, I think at some point there needs to be a very robust consultation process, and a bylaw such as this should not go ahead without that consultation. And I think, and I hope that that consultation would answer a lot of the questions that have been raised to ensure that we've got something that is appropriate, that is reasonable, and that is legitimate in the eyes of the citizens of this city.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. And I see no other hands, so thank you, sir, for your delegation today. It's appreciated. Michael Polowin is next. Following Mr. Polowin's delegation, we'll have a quick chat about length of time. We will continue today. This meeting will be continuing tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, but once Mr. Polowin's delegation is complete, we'll talk about some options for the rest of today's meeting. So Mr. Polowin, you are up. Good afternoon. Thank you to you and all of our delegates for your patience. You have up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members of the committee. Before I begin, 2 quick qualifications. Most or all of you will know that I'm a lawyer. I am not appearing as a lawyer for anyone. I am appearing here on my own behalf. Second, most or all of you will know that I am a member of the Police Services Board. This is not a matter which has been discussed at the Police Services Board, and I have no authority to speak on behalf of the Police Services Board, again, on my own hook. I've heard discussion of the charter. I've heard discussion of a chill on protest. With respect, a bubble bylaw will do neither of those. People are free, as they should be, to protest. What they can't do, what they shouldn't do, is be in the door of a vulnerable institution, be it a school, a place of worship, a senior's residence, a community center, and they're free, and I would suggest not 50 meters, but 100 meters away, to have their placards and make their protests, so long as it does not descend into hate. At the end of the day, you've heard already, and I'll only repeat briefly, we have experience in our society with bubble bylaws protecting abortion clinics, protecting during the height of the pandemic, protecting hospitals and medical clinics. This is the same thing. I can tell you, and many of you will know this, I am Jewish. I wear every day a Star of David around my neck. I will tell you as well that I have friends and family that don't do that anymore because they're intimidated. They won't identify as Jewish. I have a friend who called a rideshare company for a lift, and when the driver got to that person's house, they drove away because my friend is an observant Jew who wears a kippah every day. My community is scared. And all that I am asking, all that they are asking, is for the ability to go into a place of worship without being hassled, for children to come out of a school without facing placards. But this is not only about my community. We all saw what happened near Broadview Public School. We've seen the video that has been played for you. This is a problem, and it is a growing problem. And at the end of the day, I find it interesting that some of the people who've spoken in front of you today were very much against the convoy and sought ways, if government wasn't going to get the convoy off the streets, that they were going to take it upon themselves to do it. I will tell you that this committee needs to consider the source of delegations, and that includes me. I have an iron in the fire here. I have an axe to grind. And so my words need to be interpreted through the same lens that other people that have particular points of view should be. This is not only about Jews and Palestinians or pro-Palestinians. It is for me, but there is a much broader issue here. It is about the ability to preserve the right to demonstrate, the right to protest, which is protected in our charter, while at the same time not allowing intimidation. And that is what this is really about. A bubble zone bylaw is about preventing intimidation at a door of a vulnerable institution. And I'll leave you with the last 30 seconds. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Paulin. We do have some questions for you, Councillor Troster and then Hill. Councillor Troster.
Hi, Mr. Paulin. My question for you is, I don't know how much of the debate you listened to, but there is some conversation at this table about whether, I'm interested to hear from you whether you think it would suffice to have a bylaw that focused on safe access as opposed to preventing a nuisance demonstration. I think some of us here are thinking a more surgical approach that was standard instead of having police or bylaw make a determination of what a nuisance is, might be something that is more aligned with our constitutional requirements. I'm just interested in your perspective because there were some folks from other Jewish organizations that said, yes, they thought that would be okay.
Councillor, I don't think it should be left in the hands of a third party to determine what is or what is not a nuisance. In my view, there's a bubble around vulnerable institutions. I am suggesting 100 meters. And that's largely because of the setbacks that a number of synagogues in town have from the road. They're not right up on the road. I think the bubble, period, full stop, that no one should be put in the position of saying this is a nuisance and that isn't. Just don't go near the institution.
Okay, I actually agree with you on that. And then my other question is, it was just released today, the avenue that Toronto is looking to pursue, but it would be quite time limited and similar to Morgentaler, it would require institutions to apply. It would be time limited, and there would have to be they would have to make their case in some way. Is that an approach that you would consider acceptable, or would you want to see a blanket bubble?
Councillor, I only heard for the first time yesterday that institutions under the protection of abortion clinics need to apply. I don't know that. I'm happy to take your word for it. But having to apply then means you have to prove. I just think that whether it's a mosque, a church, a temple, a synagogue, a school, public or otherwise, that is what should be protected and that applications are not required.
Okay, and what is your feeling if those institutions are holding outside of regular faith services, meetings that may be of a political nature?
So I heard the previous speaker talk about that, Councillor, and my answer to that would be, do we really want the state inquiring into everything that's going on in a building? I can tell you that if you're dealing with a place of worship, at the same time as there might be an outside meeting, there is likely worship going on as well. Do we really want the state inquiring into that? And on the event in Vaughan, I think it was, that the speaker was referring to, the ability to protest is not disturbed by moving people 100 meters away. Let them protest as much as they want. I might agree, I might not agree, but I don't think the protection of the building should be dependent on one event taking place within that building.
Okay, thanks. That's good food for thought.
Thank you. Councillor Hill and then Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Paulin, for the delegation. One of the arguments against moving forward right now with a bubble zone bylaw is that there's an opportunity to wait for further direction from the federal or provincial government, or to ascertain some of the case law from current court cases. And my question for you is, do you see that as a reasonable alternative strategy, or do you have any concerns with that?
I have a big concern about it. At the end of the day, the provincial government isn't going to move. The premier has been very clear on that. In the heat of a campaign, the prime minister said that he would incorporate bubble zone legislation in the criminal code. How long are we going to wait for that? The other thing is that there have been cases on bubble zone bylaws that have gone through the courts throughout the country. We don't need to wait for more of them. I am concerned about what's happening now, and waiting another 9 months to do this, in my view, invites trouble.
Thank you. I've also heard that we may be exposed to legal risk from a charter challenge if we move too quickly and don't wait for other levels of government. Do you have a comment on the potential downside legal risk to moving forward municipally with a bylaw over the next 9 months?
Multiple cities have already adopted these. I don't see Vaughan being challenged. At the end of the day, in my view, hesitation invites challenge. The hesitation can lead to those opposed to a bubble zone bylaw deciding, well, you know, Ottawa was wishy-washy about this. Let's take them on in court and see if they drop it. The need for protection of these vulnerable institutions exists now, whether it's Broadview Public School or the synagogue that I go to.
There has been a comparison in terms of the amount of physical risk that some of these institutions today are subjected to in comparison to the physical risk that the abortion clinics were subjected to prior to the bubble zones being enacted in those locations. Would you say that is a fair comparable to say that the vulnerable infrastructure that we're looking to protect today meets the criteria or an acceptable threshold to merit a bubble zone?
Gee, I don't know. There have been shots fired at synagogues and schools. There has been attempted arson. There's been graffiti on all of them, including here in Ottawa. To me, that's a physical risk. But the other problem is we know that people leaving mosques and temples, Hindu temples and synagogues, have been subjected to their own physical risk, whether it is inferred or actual assault. If it's actual assault, there are laws to deal with assault. But the problem is that protests in a number of areas, often with geopolitical sources, have been getting more and more out of hand. I think it's important to say in my own terms, I am a Canadian Jew. I don't have a vote in Israel. If I did, I won't say publicly what it would be, but I don't think I'd be voting for what's going on in Gaza right now. That's the point, is that the people that are going in and out of these buildings have no say about any of this. The same is true of the video we saw in front of the Hindu temple. The people in that temple have no say over what is going on in Southern Asia. At the end of the day, we are here as Canadians. And as Canadians, we need to live together. And if we need a little urging from municipalities or other levels of government, then those levels of government need to offer them. And, you know, if you protest in front of my synagogue and you attempt to intimidate me, it's not going to change what's going on in Gaza one whit.
Mr. Paulin, thank you very much. I appreciate that. That's all, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here today, Mr. Paulin. I think it's important to just, continue to impress that as the motion is currently written, it would offer city staff the ability to create a bubble bylaw against nuisance protests, not all protests. So a protest that would fall underneath the threshold as determined by city staff could still be permitted under this motion to happen near vulnerable infrastructure. So I am hearing what you're hoping for, and I just want to make sure that we understand one another in the sense that this motion as it's currently written would likely not deliver on that piece. Similarly with Broadview School, if we had a protester come to discuss their anti-trans views that played by respectability politics, it is possible that they would still meet the threshold of a peaceful protest and be allowed near Broadview School. So this is part of the concern that many of us are having with the way that this is currently written, is that we are trying to give city staff and ostensibly police, but also I do understand there's a bit of a challenge deciding who would lead the decision making on that, but they would have the discretion on site to determine what becomes a nuisance protest, and then at that time it would be subject to the bubble bylaw. So there's some implementation challenges in this, and for me it's very important for those members of the community who are experiencing this, you know, these protests near their places of worship and other vulnerable sites, that as it's currently written, I am not certain that we will have the ability to manage protests in the way that you anticipate. And I would encourage you to follow the conversation as we go through so that we can get better clarity there and perhaps get somewhere on that piece.
Councillor, thank you. I will make two comments about use of the word nuisance. One is nuisance is a legally defined term. But like everything in the world that I live in shades of gray. I don't live in black and white. I think that the protection of these institutions needs to be black and white. Having said that, what I would say to you is that protests supporting union organizing rallies are not about intimidating the individuals within that building. I think things like that can be exempted. One of the Jewish schools in town is unionized. If there were a labor action, the members of that union should be allowed to protest. But at the same time, one day I hope my now 8-week-old grandson will go to the Ottawa Jewish Community School. I don't want him confronted with geopolitical protests. A labor action I can explain to him. Okay, his father and his mother can explain to him. But protesting, God willing, when my grandson is older, there won't be issues in the Middle East anymore. But if there still is, and he's 6 years old, why should he be confronted with that? And that's what we're talking about. It's the same thing for the children at Broadview Public School. Why should those kids be confronted by people whose views I consider to be abhorrent, but they clearly believe? And nuisance at the end of the day is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comments, and I would support your perspective that this motion introduces that level of gray that is problematic for the reasons that you describe. I am not sure that the motion as it's written will make it so that protest will be invisible to those populations in the way that we might have been talking about it at the onset. I think we just need to appreciate the language when we start talking to staff and try and unpack some of the nuance there. So thank you very much. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Councillor, and Councillor Devine is next.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Paulwin, for delegating. And I'm going to follow up on my colleague, Councillor Johnson's questions, because I think this is the fundamental discrepancy of understanding, I think, is one of the key things that we need to get a grip on. And I appreciate one of the delegates earlier was saying he would have advocated for greater consulting before action. So to Councillor Johnson's point, it is my understanding of what Councillor Johnson was saying was that in the description of what a nuisance bylaw would be, in the understanding of what the motion would currently seek, that any protest that would happen within a buffer of a house of worship, any peaceful protest that was not seeking to intimidate or reasonably causing intimidation, that protest would be legal and therefore not subject to the bubble bylaw. That is my understanding of it. But may I ask, it sounds like you are saying that it is your understanding of what would be within a bubble bylaw, what would be within a nuisance protest. Are you saying that hypothetically, if there was a protest within, as you said, 100 meters of a synagogue, and if all that protest was doing, 5, 10, 15 people waving placards, being very, very peaceful, but the message on the placard is criticizing Israel, blah, blah, blah. If that's all that's happening, would you consider that to be a nuisance protest and therefore subject to being restricted within a bubble bylaw?
Thank you, Councillor. What I would say to you is, I've already indicated I don't like the use of the term nuisance protest. At the end of the day, put whatever you want that doesn't stray into hate on your placards. Don't do it in the door of a school.
In the door of a school, I absolutely understand that. At one point earlier when you were speaking, you were talking about don't get within the door, and then you talked about 100 meters, and that's a really big door. But what I'm trying to ask you, sir.
Okay, but I can explain the 100 meters.
But
okay.
Can I just ask you, I would love you to answer my question if you don't mind.
Sure.
Are you saying, sir, that let's say you make the buffer 100 meters. Are you categorically saying that it is your expectation of a bubble bylaw that there should be no protest? It's just people waving placards, peacefully saying Israel, blah, 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 blah. Are you saying, sir, that that protest should not be happening within that buffer? Please, a very simple answer to the question.
Yes, I'm saying that.
So yes, so then if all that is happening there is a political criticism, it sounds like are you concerned more about physical safety, or are you concerned more about dissent?
No, it's not about dissent. Not at all.
Are you concerned about physical safety?
It's not an either or. It's about intimidation. And I'm going to say to you again, Councillor,
can you tell me, sir,
Johnson,
how is that
Chair?
How is
this
that
is entering into B.
I would like to get the question answered. How is it intimidation?
The chair needs intervening just for a second. I agree. It's not a back and forth. You can ask your question, and Mr. Polwin needs to answer the question that's being posed. But when Mr. Polwin's trying to answer your question, allow him to answer your question.
I'm sorry, Mr. Polwin. I'll rephrase the question. Please explain to me, as in your own words, how that kind of action is intimidation.
As I said earlier, what does my grandson, 6 years from now, have to say or do about events in the Middle East? And the same question can be asked about a Muslim school or a children at Broadview. They have nothing that they can do about it. I am a Canadian Jew. I am not Israeli. I have one citizenship. And at the end of the day, if you've seen what is on many of those placards, if you've seen the masks that are worn in many of the protest marches, it is intimidating. And so it's not physical safety, although it could be, but there are laws to deal with physical safety that are beyond the purview of the city. But at the end of the day, say whatever you want. Wave your signs. Just don't do it in the door of the school.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. And Chair Tierney, I have you last.
Great. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Michael, for coming out and speaking today. I think we heard from another Michael that did a terrific job, or Mike, from a legal perspective. I guess I just want to ask, you know, maybe in the past we would have thought, well, you know, maybe the Jewish community was highlighting some issues that were one-offs, but I find it's more than one-offs these days. And I'm asking, as a Jewish person yourself, is this why this is such a pressing issue now? It's
Yes.
not on an occasion. It seems like it's constant.
Yes.
Great answer. And that for that reason, I think, again, we've also heard that I did ask the other Mike from a legal perspective, and I understand, and you're on police board and you're wearing a separate hat today.
Yes.
But if there was enforcement from a policing perspective, which we see in some other provinces and we see it in other municipalities, could this conversation be a little bit different? And again, this is no slight on the police, because they are seeing massive crowds now. This isn't like before, where it was one-off little protests. Would that change your opinion on the need for having a bubble bylaw? Because frankly, we need something, and we're seeing this in other municipalities.
Councillor, I need to be very careful in commenting on police-related issues.
Absolutely. I won't put you in that position, but I want to thank you for coming out and speaking today.
My pleasure, and thank you, members of the committee, for listening to me.
Thank you, Mr. Pollen, for your delegation and your time as well. Okay, colleagues, it's 5 o'clock. It's been a long day. We aren't even halfway through delegations at this time. But I've received a lot of feedback about how long the meeting should continue today, and recognizing we will be continuing tomorrow at 10 o'clock. So I am going to propose that we complete our affairs today at 5:30, which is in 30 minutes, at which time all remaining speakers delegates will carry over tomorrow morning, and we will simply continue tomorrow morning. So are we in agreement with that time? Just hold on. So I see, yeah.
Yeah, and working with you, co-chair, I believe that's an appropriate course. We'll get well rested and come back tomorrow at 10 a.m. That leaves 25 minutes on the clock. Yeah. So I'd suggest we power through till 5:30 and allow other members that have been waiting patiently all day to come back tomorrow when we get to that point.
Fair enough. So if anyone needs a break, please go ahead, but we're going to continue. So I'll just call the next delegate, Karen Baker Anderson, followed by Matt Lordy. Is Ms. Baker Anderson present? I don't think she's online, Eric, no. So Matt Lorty and then Pino Buffoni. Mr. Lordy, is that yourself standing up? Excellent. Good afternoon. Thank you for your patience as well. You have up to 5 minutes.
Thank you. Esteemed members of the Emergency Preparedness Committee, I've come to you today because I wanted to give a voice to many worried citizens, not just on behalf of the citizens of Ottawa, but of other Canadian municipalities as well, concerning recent efforts to get bubble bylaws passed nationwide and the implications for the freedom of peaceful assembly and the right to peacefully protest in this country. First, I would like to address the apparent precedent of this kind of legislation, namely the Safe Access to Abortion Services Act, which was passed by the province of Ontario in 2017. The Act protects visitors of abortion clinics and their staff from potential harassment and violence by preemptively forcing anti-abortion demonstrators to keep a distance of within 50 to 150 meters from a clinic or staff member's home, with a maximum fine of $5,000 for any violations. In this instance, the restrictions imposed by the Act are reasonable and just, as there are only a comparatively small number of abortion clinics throughout the entire province of Ontario. Additionally, Jack Copel of the Toronto and York Region Labour Council pointed out through a letter to the city that incidentally shelved its own proposed bubble bylaw indefinitely, that many of the activities this proposal is meant to target, like destruction of property and violence, are already illegal. Crimes such as these should fall outside the scope of the restrictions of this proposed bylaw. Keeping these conditions in mind, the notion of not only expanding the scale of restrictions, but also the increase in fines and the application of this kind of law to other institutions such as schools, places of worship, and hospitals would, as the Canadian Civil Liberties Association stated, unreasonably limit the public's rights to demonstrate. Basing this conclusion on the City of Vaw's current bubble bylaw, imposing a maximum fine of $100,000 to protesters within a distance of 100 meters of quote-unquote socially vulnerable infrastructure, like the previously mentioned institutions, would at best make the planning and exercising of the very act of protest, peaceful or otherwise, impractical for organizers. At worst, it would cause a considerable chilling effect due to perceived ambiguities that will dissuade citizens from all manners of making their voices heard. Either scenario seriously harms local civic engagement and social affairs that matter deeply to all of us. Giving another tool such as this bylaw to the police seems unnecessary at best when Ottawa Police Services have already repeatedly demonstrated selective application of its current powers and privileges in enforcing the law, most clearly shown during the 3-week occupation of our capital by the Freedom Convoy in the winter of 2022. Another example was when police not only restrained community organizers from confronting anti-LGBT agitators harassing children at Broadview Public Elementary School last year, but even arrested a few people in the former group while allowing the agitators to act with impunity. Whether we choose to acknowledge it or not, the police, as it currently exists as an institution, reinforces existing power structures through unconscious bias and preconceptions of historically marginalized groups. It's not by happenstance that many vulnerable groups in the city, most notably racialized minority groups, the LGBTQ+ community, sex workers, people with substance abuse, and the homeless, are wary of police presence in their everyday lives. Given the troubling state of affairs in the United States under the presidency of Donald Trump, we must remain extra vigilant in ensuring that our ability to practice freedom of expression here in Canada remains protected from preemptive government overreach, as well as the brazenly preferential application of law enforcement by those who presume to protect the public interest. Political violence must be met by political resistance, and overreaching legislation such as this bubble bylaw, as it is currently being considered, will make the fight against rising authoritarianism in Canada much more difficult to overcome. Claire Zetkin, the foremost authority on the rise of fascism, having witnessed firsthand in Italy and Germany in the 1930s, made it abundantly clear that dangerous political violence is precipitated by the slow erosion of civil society.
30 seconds.
South of our border, we can witness a resurgence of this social decay and flagrant abuse of power by public officials in real time, be it via television or social media. It is imperative that we not let that very social decay spread north into our homes. If we look the other way and pretend that we're immune to the degradation of our civil society as we know it, we will learn the value of Claire Zetkin's words at our own peril, almost a century later. I thank you for your time.
Thank you for yours, and thank you for your delegation. I do have a colleague who'd like to ask a question, Councillor Troster.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I know it's a really long day. Some of you were here since the beginning with all of us. So thank you. I want to say what I share with you and what I'm most concerned about is exactly what you mentioned about giving additional powers to bylaw or to police to make a decision as to whether something is a nuisance or not. That to me at the core is what really concerns me. My question to you is, could you see supporting something that is simply about allowing safe access with a perimeter that is standardized, where there's no determination being made by police or by law, and that's basically as close to the door as possible without impeding the door? And I say this again because of my experience at Broadview Public School. That is the sticking point for me, and it's the one that I find really, really tough, especially around schools. But I think we've teased apart in this conversation the difference between having to make a determination of whether something is legitimate or a nuisance or peaceful versus guaranteeing access to specific institutions? I'm just wondering what you think.
I personally was not at the event at Broadview Elementary School, but from what I've been described, it appears as though like the anti-LGBT agitators were met by community organizers, and the community organizers felt that the police were not really there to uphold public order. They were there mainly to let the agitators act with impunity while restraining the community organizers from defending the school. So that again brings it to that double standard that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Councillor, and thank you, sir, for coming down today. Appreciate it. Next is Pino Buffoni, and then Diana Ralph. Director, I think you're online. Good to see you. You have up to 5 minutes.
Good to see you as well. Thank you. And my gratitude to members of the Joint Emergency Preparedness and Protective Services and Public Works and Infrastructure Committee. Just adding my comments very briefly, having benefited, and my gratitude for hearing the conversation this afternoon in support of the exploration of the vulnerable social infrastructure bylaw as proposed. I do appreciate the conversation this afternoon may lead to some amendments or some adjustments to the nature of the wording. I do feel on balance as Director of Education at the Ottawa Carleton District School Board that it does and is compatible as a motion for exploration with Ministry of Education direction we've received from the fall of 2024 that specifies related to safe and inclusive schools, that our schools and school-related activities or activities in and around our schools not be used as vehicles for political protests that enable inflammatory, discriminatory, and or hateful content. And I think when I think of the word vehicles there, that there have been times as referenced today that our school properties have been used as a medium for or a place in a space for some of those very protests that are inflammatory, discriminatory, or hateful in nature. Would only share for consideration of the committee that exemptions be considered. I'll just provide two. One with respect to our staff, and it's been mentioned also in previous comments with respect to any labor negotiations or labor disruptions and the ability to demonstrate of staff in that context, were it to be something related to labor. And from a student perspective, there have been occasions when our students have engaged in leadership and voice. An example there, as an example is provided for staff in climate action initiatives led by Greta Thunberg, for instance, where students have engaged in protests for climate change. So those are just two examples where I'd ask the committee to consider exemptions for both staff and students. With respect to the exploration of a bylaw provision that allows for schools and central buildings to focus on our work around learning and wellness, I think that the motion does have merit for additional exploration. And although we don't support or encourage protests or demonstrations per se, we do look for the exemption because any kind of a distance provision that would be put in place without the exemption would mean that our students or our staff, but especially for our students, would then be further from the school property. And we would just like the exemption so that we as staff can keep an eye on our students were they to participate in some protest or action in and of their own volition that we wouldn't, of course, inhibit or prevent, but we would want to keep them within a safe distance of the school property, and therefore we look for those exemptions. So thank you very much, Chair, for allowing me to speak, and thank you to the members of the committee for taking this discussion on.
Well, thank you for your delegation, Mr. Director. We do have a question from Councillor Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the delegation, Pino. I just wanted to highlight we do have a clause in this motion that speaks specifically to the Ontario Ministry of Education Safe and Inclusive Schools guideline. So I just wanted you to rest assured that we've addressed that concern. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, and Councillor Dudas, go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you very much for being here. we're talking about social infrastructure and in terms of facilities and buildings and amenities, but we're really talking about people here. And you specifically are talking about young people and children. And I wanted to just get a bit of an understanding as to when there is a protest outside of a school, particularly in elementary school, what is the implications of that for the students inside and the administrators and the educators that are trying to explain to them what is happening?
Sure, I'll give a couple of responses, one adaptive and one technical in nature. Adaptively, again, if the site where a protest takes place, the students aren't able to fully grasp the concept of what's being debated, what's being protested or demonstrated, there is a default to fear. That something that's happening outside the school is beyond what the normal day would entail for our students, especially at the elementary level, where a number of students, some of the concepts being addressed, some of the complex issues are, I won't say beyond their developmental capacity, but certainly not something that they may have engaged with previously. And so it is a new experience, and often that creates uncertainty and fear for a number of our students, especially our most youngest or our most vulnerable in that nature. On a technical front, there are complications when this happens, when it comes to the start of a school day and the end of a school day, which are busy places anyway. And if there's a protest going on right in the vicinity, I think some of the comments about safe access become an added burden and an added layer of safety for the end of the school day, transitioning, whether it's onto the bus or to parents' vehicles. When there's a protest in that area, that already complex endeavor, entering the school or exiting the school, becomes less predictable and much more difficult for staff to manage.
I also appreciated your comments carving out labor negotiations and protests in that fashion. Absolutely, there is the right to protest in that circumstance, as well as, once again, I have a teenager in the school system, and she's been very active and vocal, and I always encourage her to do that. So I like that you mentioned those things, but I also appreciate you're able to put some context around what this does to young children and maybe can't understand the concept that's being protested. So thank you very much for your delegation and your patience in being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor, and thank you again, Mr. Buffoni, for your presentation this afternoon. Next, we have Diana Ralph, followed by Robert Fox. And Ms. Ralph, I see you online. You just unmute yourself, and you'll have up to 5 minutes. You'll just need to unmute yourself, please.
Right. I'm a devout Jew and a founder of Independent Jewish Voices Canada. I'm speaking today to oppose the bubble bylaw. Hate crimes against Hindus, or for that matter against Muslims, are not the impetus for this initiative. Overwhelmingly, it is motivated by political pressure to shut down Palestinian rights to demonstrate. Every week since October 7th, Palestinians and their allies, including many Jews, have held large marches throughout downtown Ottawa to protest Canada's complicity in Israel's ongoing genocide. They want Canada to support a ceasefire in Gaza and to stop selling weapons and weapons components to Israel, which are ongoing. Israel lobby groups like B'nai B'rith, we have heard today, claim that these demonstrations are anti-Semitic because they're critical of Israel. I've been on many of those marches. They are nonviolent and well-disciplined. The organizers liaise with police and follow the prescribed routes. And far from being anti-Semitic, I've experienced nothing but appreciation and welcome as a Jew joining them. The city and the police have been ramping up tactics to block these peaceful demonstrations. Last December, without notice, they banned organizers from using megaphones and forced them to pay hefty fines. In August, after Capitol Pride issued a statement of solidarity with Palestinians, the city refused to participate in the Pride March, claiming it was anti-Semitic. I marched, carrying a sign identifying myself as a Jew, and at every block, people cheered me. On November 11th this year, the principal of Sir Robert Borden High School included Haza Salam, an Arabic peace song, in its Remembrance Day celebrations. In response, the mayor and some city councilors condemned him, and the school board forced him to apologize and launched an investigation of him. On November 19th, without provocation, the police arrested and assaulted several Palestinian youth movement leaders, including my friend Sarah Mukahel. The proposed so-called bubble bylaw is just another excuse to deter us from effectively protesting. Freedom of religion is not under threat. These demonstrations do not go targeting schools or barging into places that threaten people. Bubble bylaws have been used in the past to stop vaccine protesters from threatening hospital staff and patients, and to prevent anti-abortion protesters from harassing women using abortion clinics. This is different. The anti-vax and anti-abortion protesters actively harassed, threatened, and physically attacked patients and staff. But the Palestine protests don't do anything like that. No one has been assaulted or injured during these marches. They don't target synagogues or other Jewish institutions. The one exception was in Vaughan. An anti-Israel protest did take place outside a synagogue on December 9th, but the demonstrators were not protesting Judaism. They were protesting a real estate expo there that was illegally selling Palestinian land. The Vaughan police didn't invoke the bylaw then out of fears that to do so would violate the charter. As you know, Section 2 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms protects our right to participate in peaceful demonstrations and other assemblies. Our marches clearly come under that provision. Current police powers are adequate. There is no need for a bubble bylaw. Of course, as a Jew, I oppose anti-Semitism and have all my life. But supporting Palestinian human rights is not anti-Semitic. At its core, Judaism demands justice and compassion. A bubble bylaw would allow allegations of discomfort or fear by some Jews, as we've heard today, to shut down rights of concerned Canadians to oppose Canada's complicity in bombing and starving Palestinian people. So please, I'm ready to stop. Please don't sacrifice our precious free speech rights, and please vote against the bubble bylaw. Thank you.
Thank you for your delegation. It's appreciated. I see no hands for questions, so thank you again for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Robert Fox, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I would have preferred perhaps to be the first thing tomorrow morning than the last thing at a long day. As many of you know, I'm a long-term, lifelong advocate for justice, for peace, and for a healthy planet. I'm also old. I've attended more than 1,000 demonstrations in the city over the last almost 60 years on war and war crimes, on acid rain and climate chaos, on racism, colonialism, capitalism, land back and take back the night, a full range of things, all of which are intended to protect human rights and human dignity. And I've done this as well internationally and had the opportunity to participate in demonstrations around the world. In this city and around the world, dissent is under attack. Laws and law enforcement are being weaponized to protect the powerful and the comfortable, and to restrict our rights to free expression, to free association, to peaceful assembly. The most powerful are criminalizing the efforts of those with less power to speak up, to speak out, to come together to defend our rights, to protest an injustice, and to press for change. We've already seen the impact of over-policing on public protest in this city. The arrests, the fines, the harassment, the provocations, the doxing, the intimidation. And we have already witnessed the unequal application of that, the targeting of that repression. First and foremost on Indigenous and Black and queer and Palestinian and poor people. Students mobilizing on campus, labor leaders defending their own members. All of this in a city where the convoy crowd was allowed to camp out on Wellington Street for 3 weeks. The bubble bylaw will only increase this problem. We have no confidence in the capacity of this body to frame a bylaw that can be justly and equitably applied, and we have no confidence in the capacity of OPS or bylaw to enforce the bylaw in such a way as to protect our rights. Protests by their nature are intended to be disruptive. They're intended to raise awareness. They're intended to be in your face. They're intended to afflict the comfortable and to express outrage and conviction. It is important that we recognize that no one has the right to comfort. That's not what it can be about. And that if you take preemptive action that denies people the right to come together, that is a much greater violation of people's rights than to have people have actions take place that then are criminal and are pursued through criminal action that again has due process, that actually weighs the evidence, weighs the consequences, and comes to conclusions. So any action that preemptively prevents us from making these statements is clearly problematic. I'm a cis, white, male baby boomer, Canadian educated, Canadian born, home owning. Privilege doesn't get any better than what I go through in my life, right? But I'm uncomfortable every day in this city. I'm uncomfortable by the inequality I see, by the injustice I see, by the racism and misogyny I see. That is why I and other people are in the streets. A bubble bylaw that does not acknowledge that the complexity and complicity we all engage in when we sit around and are not outraged by what we see and are not taking action to address it.
1 minute.
Is going to be a failure. It's going to be bad law. It's going to be a bad signal. It's going to be a bad precedent. And if we in Canada, in this city, Ottawa, cannot defend fully and forcefully the right to dissent, what signal are we sending to the people who've attended demonstrations I've attended in Soweto, in Guatemala City, in Harare, in other parts of the world where the Ukraine, where their rights are seriously under pressure. So I encourage you to think about this. As I say, you will lose this in the courts. You will lose this in the court of public opinion. And as a very last quick point, as the co-chair of the Ottawa People's Commission, the fact that this council found no time to have any conversation about the recommendations of the People's Commission, but all of a sudden this is urgent, important, and pressing, and has to replace other work for the city, is disturbing.
Thank you for your presentation. We do have a question for you from Councillor Troster.
Thank you, Robert. Robert is a resident of Somerset Ward, and for those who also know, was the former chief of staff of the incredible Mayor Marion Dewar back in the day. So he knows a few things, not just about protests, but also about city administration. My question for you, Robert, is how might we protect access to vulnerable institutions?
Well, as I say, I think some of the ideas that you're looking at have prospects, but they need to be looked at more carefully. My concern about the bylaw is the preemptive nature of the bylaw, right. The presumption that it is going to violate someone else's rights. So you're going to deny me my rights because I might do something that might prevent someone else's rights, someone else to exercise their rights. So some of the questions about access may be the way that we negotiate that. I've been on many picket lines. Every now and then we let a car through. That is the balance that we strike in order to preserve a level of civility without pretending that their comfort is of any concern to me at all, right? And so, as I say, there are some things we can look at, but the preemptive nature, the all-encompassing nature of this is unacceptable and will not stand.
Thank you. And I'll hold those words close to my heart because I think that gets the crux of my issue. I think people have a right to access these institutions, but we don't have the right to comfort. And I think that is also where I struggle. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you. So I just wonder if you could comment, and nice to see you, about how you think this might impact the role of the counter-protester. In my view, it's like, okay, we're going to create a bubble, and we're going to say you can protest this far outside of the bubble. Typically, a counter-protest inserts themselves between, if we want to use the Broadview School example again, between the anti-trans protest and the vulnerable institution. Could you foresee a situation where the counter protest actually is squeezed out? Because once we move outside this bubble zone, there's no regulation in place for police or bylaw to enforce location.
So part of the complexity of this, as you know, is that the sense is that all these people are others. Most of the counter protests arise from the people from the community themselves. They're the parents of the children of that school. They have a right and a vested interest in inserting themselves in that situation. That's what we ask parents to do to protect their children. They're looking to the state to support them in that. The state then, its action, its role arises when illegal things happen. And its role is to create an environment that respects people's rights, supports people's rights, empowers them in exercising those rights. We too often have this absolute perversion of the dynamic where the people who are defending a vulnerable constituency are the ones that are the object of police action rather than the subject of police understanding what's going on here, right? And so, yes, once you get into these discretionary situations where someone is trying to decide who's the good guy here, who's the bad guy here, what's going on here, you actually complicate and make more volatile the situation. And so if you were going to go the bubble route, you're going to have two bubbles. You're going to have some triangulation because they're all 100 meters apart, and they're also 100 meters apart from what you've identified as population, 100 meters apart from each other. But you just get into this absurdity, which is unenforceable, which then creates opportunities for a lack of respect for the law because they can't do it, and you wrote it, and you can't explain it or defend it. And the community looks back and says, fools. Meanwhile, my rights have been restricted. And as the example we're setting as the national capital is to provide leadership in the support and defense of our rights and the Constitution, most particularly our rights, in this instance, to protest. All sorts of things have been said today about victimization. In 99 of the 100 cases, none of them were related to a protest. So let us please distinguish between all sorts of bad things that are happening in this country that we have a collective interest and commitment to addressing, and how that's all of a sudden all mixed up to protests that are walking through the streets 99 times out of 100, and yeah, disrupting a little traffic. You have to wait a little longer here. That's absolutely charter protected. So how all this has become perverted around, we have to protect a daycare. None of the protests I've been at lately have gone to a daycare. So let's have a real conversation, not a manufactured not a crisis conversation about a manufactured problem.
Thank you. Yeah. So I understand what you're saying. I am a little anxious that in the case of, again, if we were to use Broadview School, that we have some anti-trans protesters that, again, engage in respectability politics, and they come and they act really polite and they look the way that you should look as a, law-abiding citizen and all their sort of actions. And they come and they stand, 50 meters away, let's say. Or, well, actually, they wouldn't. If they were peaceful, perhaps they could stand as close as they wanted to, as it's currently written in the motion. And then you've already communicated that a bubble bylaw could be in effect. We've already done it as a city. So the school moms and dads that perhaps would like to actually go out and are more law-abiding than perhaps those that are coming to do the protest would feel that a bylaw restriction would be enough for them to say, you know what, they're not going to say, city, you're fools. They're just going to say, you know what, forget it. Forget it. I don't know enough about it. I find this confusing. I don't think it's worth it. And I'm certain that ultimately it's going to be a police issue if there's a problem. And now you have unrestricted access. Also, you've eliminated the opportunity for people to gather and find one another in solidarity for values that they find really important to them, which I think we all would agree that the convoy has the COVID, has really strained our ability to find mutual gathering spaces that are meaningful I think a lot of this might relate to that and how we have further division because we discuss things on social media, and we haven't talked about the civility of social media. We're talking about civility on the ground and what's more frequent here. Where are the regulations really needed? Anyway, I digress. All I mean to say is that I do think currently the way that the motion is written has many unintended consequences for what I am concerned about its actual applications, even for those who are asking for it, having a misunderstanding of what it could actually achieve on the ground. So I look forward to asking many questions to staff tomorrow. Thank you very much for your delegation.
Thank you. No,
it further chills.
I'm just going to intervene, please. We've got to continue going on here. It wasn't a question. We're going to continue with Councillor Kelly at this point.
Thank you very much, Chair. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I think many, I'm not in the room, I'm on the screen. Many people who have interacted with councillors leading up to this debate, and certainly some who have delegated today would certainly take issue with your characterization that these concerns are somehow being manufactured. And I heard you talk a lot about comfort, and I would be the first person as an elected official to agree with you that certainly my comfort when I go to work as a councillor, or if I was an elected official at another level, certainly I think it's implied by putting your name on the ballot or working with a politician or in those institutions that your comfort is not guaranteed. Absolutely. There's bound to be protests outside of chambers and city halls and Parliament Hill and other legislative bodies where policies are made. I, as a parent of a child who will go to school in a couple of years, absolutely believe that a student and their parents and their teachers and other staff working in the school absolutely should be guaranteed their comfort and ability to enjoy their time and get a good education. So are you seriously making the argument that your right to protest is more important than the comfort and well-being of nurses going into a hospital to provide healthcare and vaccines during a global pandemic where we're having mass graves in New York City?
So my position is that it is a very slippery slope when you start to restrict the right to protest.
Well, what's slippery then? Can you be specific? So 100 meters from the school, you can protest there, but you can't protest 50 meters from the school. How's that a slippery slope?
So and that any restriction that is put on the capacity of people to come together to express opinions has to be based on evidence that there's a risk there and I'm not seeing large numbers of these demonstrations, and I think that that there are laws that deal with criminal behavior that could be used. And so the response here to have a general legislation that preempts activities, including protests, when you start to administer those, so the students are going to be excluded because that makes sense, and the teachers will be excluded because that makes sense, and quite frankly, the parents should be excluded because that makes sense. You find yourself in a situation where you've created a whole legal superstructure that will not withstand a charter challenge, rather than dealing specifically with issues when they arise. Adults talking to people one-to-one as situations arrive and dealing with those situations as they arrive. Supporting communities as they ensure that their children within those schools are safe and protected. There's a whole approach to this that doesn't involve bylaws, doesn't involve bylaw officers, doesn't involve all sorts of staff time and court cases that are actually the wrong response to an issue which, when we actually identify how often does this happen, where does it happen, when does it happen, and with a consequence does it happen, you would have a different approach to dealing with it.
Thank you. My last question, obviously you're an experienced demonstrator. You've mentioned that you've been at thousands of these protests across the world. How many of them would you say took place within 100 meters of a school or a hospital or a place of worship?
Well, very, very, very few of them, because most demonstrations, that's not the target, and that's not where it happens. That said, I organized a demonstration when I was the head boy of Sir Johnny Macdonald High School in the West End in 1967. And I have been at demonstrations in front of churches when there were pedophiles still in the pulpits of those churches. And I have been at demonstrations in Soweto when there was when Black people were not able to access health care from the health clinic in their community. So in exceptional circumstances, those are appropriate targets, and I would not want anything ever to happen that would bar or limit our capacity to be where we need to be, to freely assemble peacefully as an object of a protest.
And do you think you could freely and peacefully assemble 100 meters from one of those places? It's possible to do that, right?
The chill that
But
this
is
sort of
it
bylaw
possible
sets
though?
is
Would it stop you from expressing your opinion?
I think it will come as no surprise to you. It would not stop me from expressing my opinion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No more questions.
But it would deter many people from going, because they would think that
I'm done though, so thank you.
They could be in a confrontation with police.
Councillor,
they could be otherwise.
The delegate was allowed to answer the question, but thank you, Councillor Kelly. Councillor Plant has her hand up, and then we will finish for today.
Hi, thank you. I'll be quick. I know we're all kind of itching here. I think what Councillor Kelly is trying to say, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think he's saying there's a certain subset of the population, in this case, children, because his example revolved around that, who are the vulnerable of the vulnerable. Like, we have the vulnerable infrastructure, and they are the vulnerable of the vulnerable, because they don't have a choice where they live. They don't have a choice usually what school they go to. They don't have a choice who their parents are. They don't have a lot of choices. They're just subjected to them, and they live with them. And then maybe when they're older, they make different choices or not. And I would agree with Councillor Kelly that that is a population that we absolutely have to do everything in our power to protect, because when they are at a school, and I'll just give you an example. My son went to Franco Jeunesse in Sandy Hill, and during the convoy, a lot of the convoy people stayed in Sandy Hill in Airbnbs. And they would go up to the fence at recess and taunt the children and say, why are you wearing that mask? Take that off. Don't you want to breathe? When children were speaking French, they would make fun of them, etc. And it was hell on wheels to try to get them help, because they weren't in the thick of the convoy. They weren't necessarily protesting in a traditional sense. They had their flags and all that. So I think what he's trying to say, and I will reach out to him afterwards just to confirm, that there is a certain subset of the population that we treat in a very special and nuanced way, because their brains have not formed at the point to understand the critique of what is happening in front of them. And they're not people who have asked to have a lot of things inflicted upon them.
And I have huge sympathy for that position. And clearly the convoy went on weeks longer than it should have, except we were facilitating it for that long. And I've been at the last two of the Broadview situations, and again, in the most recent one, Billboard Chris was on that street for 2 days before the official protest, and the police were providing a police escort to him through those 2 days, protecting him as he was talking to people on those streets in front of that school on the Wednesday and Thursday, even before the Friday demonstration. If, in fact, our efforts were to create a community sense of this is unacceptable, no one can do this, this is about social mores and social values, we have to build those so it's absolutely clear that no one would even think of doing what people came from across Canada to do in front of that school. It was objectionable, it was outrageous, it is indefensible, but it is not illegal, and so you have a different strategy and response to it.
I understand that, but you could say, well, it's not illegal to date a 16-year-old as an adult, but should you do it? Well, of course not.
No.
So I have a responsibility as a parent to protect that 16-year-old.
Absolutely.
So that's exactly what I'm getting at. And I just have a quick question for OPS. Can you
And so you
confirm?
should be able to come to the.
Sorry, I'm not done. I'm not finished.
No, but
can
we're
you
not asking questions to staff right now either.
We're not?
No.
Okay, sorry. But
for
thank you. I
delegation.
appreciate your perspective.
And you should be able as a parent to come to the school and defend your student, and this bylaw would present that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your passion and for coming. Good way to close this afternoon. So we are going to, I'm not sure the right terminology is recess this afternoon. This meeting shall continue tomorrow, Friday, May 16th at 10 a.m. So we will reconvene at that time tomorrow. Have a good night, everyone.